Good morning and welcome to the 669th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club, and it's an honor to be here with all of you in our milestone year, our 115th anniversary. The Economic Club of New York is the nation's leading nonpartisan forum for discussions on economic, social, and political issues. And we've had more than 1,000 prominent leaders come before us over a century here. A special welcome to members of the ECNY 2022 class of fellows, a select group of diverse, rising, next-gen business thought leaders, many of whom, by the way, have come over time from both Columbia and Harvard, both the institutions represented here. Today, we are truly honored to welcome back two of America's leading economists and ECNY club members, are Glenn Hubbard and Lawrence Summers. Although they need no introduction, let me briefly introduce them to anyone new today. Glenn is the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia University. He previously served as the Dean of the Columbia Graduate School of Business from 2004 to 2019. He was also chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors from 2001 until 2003, and chair of the Economic Club of New York from 2007 to 2010. Currently, he's on the boards of ADP, BlackRock Fixed Income Funds, co-chair of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, and MetLife, where he serves as chair. Larry is the Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard University. He has served in a series of senior policy positions in Washington, D.C., including the 71st Secretary of Treasury for President Clinton, Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama, and Vice President of Development Economics and Chief Economist of the World Bank. He's currently the Charles W. Eliot University Professor at Harvard University and the Weill Director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. The format today will be a conversation and will end promptly at noon. Any questions that were submitted to the club from members were shared. And thank you to all of you that sent those in. And they may be addressed during the conversation if time permits. We're also using the chat box for the conversation, so you can enter questions directly into the chat box for their conversation. And if time permits, again, they'll try to use those. Again, I think the hour is going to go quickly. As a reminder of this conversation is on the record. We do have a lot of media on the line today. Gentlemen, if you're ready, I'm happy to pass this time over to the two of you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Thanks to everybody for joining. Larry, there's a lot going on we could talk about, but I think it's important that we start with inflation. We got the print this morning for CPI, 9.1%, and the headline, worst since late 1981, core of 5.9%, some particulars in there, but really across the board issues. I wanted to, maybe each of us could give some views on whether we think this is something like a peak inflation. Is this as bad as it's going to get? And how much more work we think the Fed's got to do to bring it down closer to the target range of 2%. And I think given that it's come up both among commentators and in the political process, probably worth also talking about the role of micro policies, whether it's the policies of particular companies, market power, other kinds of arguments in this inflation debate. So I'll let you start.
So let's start on the what's going to happen to inflation, and then maybe we can talk a bit about the Fed, and then maybe we can talk about other non-monetary policies with respect to all of this. I don't really understand why the forecasting community keeps coming in low. Seems like almost every month the surprise is on the high side. And I don't really quite get why people keep making the same kind of mistake. I think these have to be quite disturbing figures. If you look at core inflation and you look at the last month's data, it's running at a rate above 8%. If you look at the last month is more than the last 3 months, the last 3 months is more than the last 6 months, and the last 6 months is more than the last year. And that's core inflation. It takes all the oil out, takes all the foodstuffs out, takes much of by taking energy and food out, takes much of the commodities and much of the impact of the Ukraine war out. So I think it's not possible to believe that the situation is currently under control. And that is not a credible view to have. I think the interesting question is how much more it will take to bring the situation under control, and whatever monetary policies are part of bringing the situation under control, what level of economic slack is likely to result. And I guess, Glenn, the data that impresses me is the data that says that soft landings are mostly like second marriage, the triumph of hope over experience. That when inflation's above 4 and unemployment's below 4, we've never had one in the United States. And if you look around the industrial world, you don't see them. If you look at it a slightly different way, there's a proposition, I think first enunciated by Bill Dudley, but widely known as Somm's rule, after Claudius Somm, who did careful and important work on it, that when the unemployment rate goes up by 0.5%, it goes up by more than 2%. So I think it is unlikely very unlikely that we will see inflation come down to target range without a significant economic downturn. Olivier Blanchard, Alex Domash, and I have a paper that we released today that uses the Beveridge curve, data on both unemployment and vacancies, to estimate what the non-accelerating inflation unemployment rate is. And our estimate is that it's in the 5% range. And I think that may be slightly conservative. So we need a quite substantial slowing just to get to normal and back to capacity. And if you want to have inflation come out of the system, you got to get below capacity output for some interval where supply exceeds demand. So my best guess would be that we're not out of this without a significant interval of 6% unemployment. And I think it's a real question what the timing will be, whether the Fed will have the resolve to carry through. You know, doctors tell me that they always tell their patients to take a full 10-day course of an antibiotic, but usually their patients stop taking it when they feel better. And I think the proposition here is when inflation starts to come down and when there's evident weakness, does that mean that monetary policy has moved enough to achieve a durable victory of against inflation, or only a remission? And I think those are going to be very difficult judgments for our central bank. What's conspicuous about most past inflations is that they didn't get stopped at the first pump of the brakes. That even Paul Volcker had a attempt to stop inflation, a weakening economy, a loosening of policy, and a reacceleration of inflation in 1980. And of course, if you look at the whole history from 1965 through the Volcker disinflation, you saw a great deal of that. So it's no secret to this group that I've been alarmed about inflation for quite some time. And I don't think there's much in today's number that does anything other than reinforce those concerns.
If I could jump in there before we get to the micro aspects, I broadly agree with you, Larry. I think the policy error that many of us have talked about for a long time was the failure to recognize excess demand growth, to blame everything on alternatives, whether it was supply factors generally or stemming from Ukraine. The underlying rate of inflation is extremely troublesome, and it's very hard to imagine a world in which even the rollback reasonably of supply chain disruptions and so on gets us down any lower than 4 to 5%. Indeed, the concern I would have is whether the Federal Reserve, not for technical reasons, but for political concerns and others, just decides that that's as good as it gets. I worry that the same error that was made in the so-called new framework of waiting till the whites of the eyes can also be made on this side too. It's not so much that the Fed's actions today are going to have a very sharp effect on very short run inflation. It's likely to remain elevated for a period of time for a number of reasons. I think the question is about forward-looking measures of expectations. And there, I think the Fed doesn't have much of a handle. I worry about it. I worry about it significantly. So I don't see the rate of inflation coming down on its own. I don't see Fed policy being able to do so successfully. You know, there are very thoughtful economists like our mutual friend Alan Blinder who have pointed to a number of episodes of success. But to me, the period this seems closest to, you mentioned the Volcker episode, that period from 75 to 83 seems a little more salient here. And that is not a period that would give us, a great deal of comfort in this setting. So I don't see a quick end.
I think we are basically in raging agreement, Glenn. And I think the question is how long this episode is going to continue and the extent to which it becomes stagflationary and inflation expectations become entrenched. I have enormous respect for Alan Blinder, but I do not think the claims that the Fed has successfully achieved soft landings have much to do with the current situation. It is true that in 1994, for example, that the Fed raised rates significantly, that the recovery continued, and that we didn't have inflation. However, we raised rates starting from an unemployment in the 5s and an inflation in the 2s. And we avoided having a big problem, but I don't know what that's got to do with inflation in the 9s and unemployment in the 3s. And if you look at the other examples cited as soft landings, I think they either come from the very distant past after World War II and the whole world operated differently, or they didn't really involve a moment when you had an overheated economy with accelerating inflation. In fact, one of the other papers I've written recently with Alex Domash makes the point that the classic data through which many see the 1970s uses the CPI as it was during the 1970s. During the 1970s, the mortgage interest rate itself was a component of the CPI. So you had a very volatile CPI where inflation got high and inflation came back. If you use a CPI that's computed like the CPI is computed today, the necessary disinflation is, depending on how you do it, certainly more than half and perhaps 80% of the disinflation that was necessary in the 1970s. I am puzzled by the thinking, if it is thinking, in the official sector, and I refer to the Fed, I refer to the CBO, I refer to the administration's forecast, I refer to the IMF's forecast, all of which envision a kind of immaculate disinflation to the 2% range, with unemployment never getting above the low fours over the next couple of years. And that seems to me to be extraordinarily unlikely and a disservice to the credibility of all of these institutions. And I think it's costly, Glenn, to lose your credibility. It's costly because sometimes what you think is right. You know, there is going to be a very difficult argument going forward about how to think about the very important components of inflation that involve housing. Without turning this into a hugely technical discussion, the CPI and the PCE's measures of housing inflation basically are very long-term moving averages of what has actually happened to the price of houses and what has actually happened to new tenants, because they're trying to capture the price for all the people who moved into their apartment with a lease 9 months ago. So they're very long-term moving averages. That means that, as we saw this month, they're moving up as a consequence of everything that happened last year when prices and rents went up by 20%. That's going to keep on happening. Now, you could argue that for purposes of making policy, it would be better to look at more contemporaneous indicators, the kind of thing that comes from Zillow or CoreLogic. You could argue that, and it's actually, I think, a quite reasonable argument. But if you were confidently blaring on Team Transitory until 3 months ago, you are singularly ill-positioned to make that argument because of how far off you were for how long. And so I think there's something really quite costly about the established record of poor inflation forecasting that many of the official institutions have, and that, frankly, many in the private sector have as well.
I certainly agree with that. That's what I meant before, that a lot of this run-up is going to be baked in the cake. Why it can't come down quickly because of the way housing is measured, and rents in particular. I take it that you would agree with me that market forecasts of, let's say, a funds rate heading up into the 4% range are not going to be sufficient to right this ship.
I'm sorry, I missed the last thing you said.
That a forecast of the funds rate going to in the 4% range would not be sufficient to right the ship.
I suspect that's, my suspicion would be that will prove to be right. I'm actually less certain of that than I am that we will need a period of substantial slack. It is plausible to me that even with a Fed funds rate of 4%, between the rolling off of fiscal stimulus, the erosion of real incomes by inflation, the effects of uncertainty on spending decisions, and the supply shock consequences associated with what's happening in the Iraq war, I could imagine that we could have a relatively significant downturn without interest rates rising as high as standard rules would suggest. So I would agree with you that I think interest rates are likely to rise more than the Fed is projecting and more than markets are projecting. But I am less confident of that than I am that it's going to be very hard for this inflation to disappear without meaningful economic slack, which has to start with moving past the current overheating.
No, I think that's certainly true. And I guess a risk is that a Fed that's trying to reestablish its credibility moves even more aggressively than necessary to create the slack that it needs. We'll have to stay tuned. But I did want to talk about a couple of micro issues you and I talked about pricing decisions of firms and market power. And then I also want to come to taxes in this environment. But first, what do you think of the environment that one way to deal with this is by critiquing anything from price gouging to market power of firms? And what kind of role is that, in your view, playing in current inflation?
Pretty close to none.
I'm heartened to hear you say that.
I think there is a case for a number of spheres more aggressive antitrust action. And
that's a different question.
I certainly do not want to be heard as saying that competition policy is not a very important area for initiative. But to explain inflation, it has to be deteriorating conditions in terms of monopoly. And I don't think there's any evidence that that's something that we've seen to a substantial degree. There may well be some issues that play out over a span of weeks. There's a phenomenon known as rockets and feathers, where in some kinds of industries, there's a tendency for prices to go up faster than they go down. But it's not a fundamental matter. It's about the underlying inflation process. It has to do with the daily and weekly and maybe even a very small number of months aspects of pricing. So I don't think that is a case that has been made. And I think the danger is that if you seek too aggressively to reduce prices, you create shortages. And that doesn't serve, that may cause you to have measured lower prices, but in some sense, if some people can't get the stuff at any price, that's not really a reduction in costs. I do think, Glenn, and I'm not sure how far you would go, and it's clearly a matter of balance, that just as Harvard or Columbia University use their purchasing power to buy tickets on the shuttle or computers at lower cost than any one professor could individually, that it's appropriate for the government through Medicare to do something similar as it purchases pharmaceuticals and as it purchases medical goods more generally. And so I think to suggest that as part of reducing prices in an important sector, the government be a more efficient procurer is, I think, a good idea carried to a certain point, and that people who label that as price controls really aren't getting it right. It's the proper use of the power that a large purchaser has. And I think that could make a useful contribution to reducing inflation.
I think these are
the epicenter of inflation right now is in many ways the residential markets. That the 20% inflation we've seen over the year and a half since 2021 in home prices, in rental prices for new tenants. And that's not about monopoly. There are millions of houses, there are huge numbers of choices that people have. So I do think that the fruitful lines of work are more efficient government purchasing, which I mentioned with respect to pharmaceuticals, but there are other sectors where government could effectively focus on purchasing as inexpensively as possible. I think there's a strong case. I was involved with the Peterson Institute study that made the case for reducing tariffs. And I think a reasonable tariff reduction program could, on a one-shot basis, take 1% off the CPI. I think there are pretty severe limits to what you could do quickly, but I think we need a both and energy policy, not an either or energy policy. And it's crazy the way we have blocked pipelines in this country. It's bad for consumers. It's bad for security. It's bad for the environment when oil is being shipped on trucks and trains. It's bad for resilience. It's just the wrong thing to be doing. And I think it's something that we need to find. We need to find a way to fix. I think we need, in the micro realm, I think that some of the job of cooling the economy would probably at this point best be done with appropriate tax measures.
Yeah, I want to come in on that, Larry, because I think you've raised good points on the pricing things. The theories of monopoly and markups are about levels, not about rates of change typically. So there's no there for the reasons that you mentioned. I certainly would support rolling back the tariffs, but I would always support rolling back the tariffs. I mean, they're inefficient, but those two are kind of one-off effects. It's good economic policy to do, but I'm not sure it has much to do with the current inflation debate. I'm a little more nervous about the negotiation you mentioned. I actually can buy a computer cheaper than Columbia. Maybe Harvard is more efficient. Columbia signs long-term contracts, and I'm quite aware that prices fall continuously. So I actually get better deals myself than the university. But I worry that the line between negotiating as a big purchaser and price controls is not as black and white and clear as you suggested. I was going to come back to energy, but since you raised it, I want to pick up on this because I think it's very important in the current environment with the crisis in Ukraine, as well as long-term challenges that clearly face us in environmental policy and climate change. I cannot imagine a world in which oil and gas isn't very important for a substantial period of time, even with long-term concerns about climate change that I know that both of us share. So I would definitely underscore what you said, that we need to be working on making sure we have efficient and growing levels of energy production in the United States. And it seems odd to me that we would be trying to negotiate with Venezuela or Saudi Arabia for treatment as opposed to better regulatory policy at home. And I don't see that as being inconsistent with a long-term path toward a different energy mix, but that energy mix is going to change over periods of decades, not handfuls of years. And I just can't imagine a transition that doesn't involve new oil and gas investment globally and in the United States over the next few decades. I don't know if you would agree.
Look, I think again, we're in broad agreement. I think probably I am a little bit. I'd say two things. One is airline deregulation, which I think was a historic and important achievement, derived political momentum from the fact that there was inflation going on. And so I don't think there's any harm in good microeconomic policies that aren't centrally about money and inflation, drawing energy from the inflation problem. So it's okay with me. And I think that when you're trying to prevent a wage price spiral in a country where the inflation rate is 9%, it's not a trivial thing to take a couple points off the CPI for a year, and it's reducing the spiral. So yes, it's probably true that some of the policies would be policies that would be good in any event, but I don't think it's inappropriate to add them to a list of anti-inflation policies. I think reflecting the fact that I've worked in Democratic administrations and that you've worked in Republican administrations, we probably have a mild disagreement on the pharmaceuticals and energy. We both agree that they are matters of balance. You're probably slightly more alarmed than I am about the government working at purchasing pharmaceuticals efficiently, recognizing that it has market power. You're probably more alarmed than I am about the risks that will get out of control and do a lot of damage to incentives. And I'm probably a bit more wanting to distinguish between policies that will matter over a limited horizon, when the Ukraine war will continue and oil and gas will be in short supply, where I am all for a very aggressive policy menu. And I probably see more danger of people trying to relitigate issues around hydrocarbons versus renewables over a 10 to 20 year horizon that have been resolved by the country. And part of the reason I put more emphasis on pipelines, and I would also emphasize permits from leases that have already been given, is that I think those are things that can make a difference over the horizon where we have a critical problem.
Well, I think we can both agree it's a good place to start. But I want to turn to taxes. So you mentioned earlier, and I would agree, we already are seeing a rollback of the very large fiscal stimulus that had been in the system, the sort of gradual unwinding of that. Is it your view that we need a tax increase over and above that unwinding? And if so, how?
Look, I think one of the best and most important things that the Biden administration has done is the global corporate tax agreement. I think that global corporate tax agreement is very important in three respects. I think it stands for the proposition that we're going to try to tax capital, even though it's mobile across international borders, rather than each country only taxing people who are less mobile across international borders. And I think if we're going to maintain the legitimacy of international integration, that's hugely important. I think the second thing that's hugely important about it is that pillar sits alongside another pillar, which in the overall architecture of an international tax agreement protects American companies from punitive digital taxation in a range of other countries, particularly in Europe, and is therefore really profoundly important to a number of our leading technology companies. I think the third thing is that if we allow a regime in which you can benefit by locating businesses in haven jurisdictions, that is over time reducing the supply of capital to the United States, which is reducing the supply of output, which ultimately makes our workers less productive and earning less. And less supply in certain ways may contribute to the inflation process. So I think the single most important tax priority is that we do what's necessary to enable the global tax treaty that we led the world on. And so it's not another case like TPP of the US leads everybody on a march up the hill, and then the US goes into retreat. And to do that requires that we put in place a corporate minimum tax. And for a variety of technical reasons, it requires that we apply when we look at companies that have avoided taxes by locating abroad, that we do that on a country by country basis rather than in aggregate, the so-called guilty provisions. And I believe that passing that is in our interests in supporting what I think probably almost everybody on this call believes in, which is global integration, in our interests in terms of maximizing the productive potential of the American economy, in our interests in terms of protecting our companies from punitive retaliation. And I also think we can use the revenue. I think we're going to find that our tax revenue situation is going to deteriorate more than most people expect, because it's going to turn out that the very strong stock market, which we have no longer, and which may well further deteriorate, along with the expectation, which proved to be wrong, that taxes would be increased this year, led to a huge wave of capital gains realizations and revenue generation that not only was transitory, but to some extent, people realized the gains in 2021 that they otherwise would have realized in 2022 and 2023. So I suspect that as it gets calculated and recalculated, our fiscal outlook is going to deteriorate quite substantially. And that also contributes to the case for revenue increases.
Well, I want to come to the fiscal outlook in a moment, but to your point, I certainly would support sparing our tech companies or U.S. large business generally from punitive taxation by others. I'm less supportive of a minimum tax at anything other than a fairly modest rate, simply for reasons of tax competition, in my view, actually not being such a bad idea. But I want to be clear. Are you suggesting this is actually the kind of tax increase that leads to the reduction in aggregate demand? Going back to our discussion about inflation and trying to restrain, you're making a lot of tax policy arguments. I might agree or disagree, but are you actually suggesting that that's the kind of tax increase that would help put the brakes, or this is a tax increase for some other reason?
If the only objective were to put the brakes, that's probably not the one you would choose. But if you have a tax policy that is compelling on overall grounds and will operate in the direction of putting the brakes on, I think it is a desirable. I think it's a desirable thing to pass and implement. And Glenn, I understand the arguments for tax competition, but I don't think that's an easy proposition to defend when the status quo is easy to defend. When you look at the data on where do U.S. multinational corporations earn the most foreign profits, and the leading examples are various islands in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, I think it's hard to defend that that's a system working right. If there's some competition between the United States and Germany and Japan, and in the same way that there's competition between some states, I can certainly see the case for that. But I think the argument, when you have the amount of losses that we now have to what really are tax havens for doing something to clean up the system, really is very compelling. And I think Secretary Yellen really had a historic achievement. And it's going to turn into being worse than having done nothing if once again the United States drove an international agreement, and then once again the United States stands out for not having been part of it.
Well, again, this is a question, you can turn to something else about how high a minimum rate would be. I take the problem, but don't necessarily take the solution. To the TPP example, I mean,
15%, I think 15, I think it's hard to argue against a 15% rate, which is what is at issue, and to believe that a 15% rate would be hugely punitive in light of the current level of corporate profits. I think it's safe to say that you could pass everything that is being suggested in this regard, and corporate profits in almost every sector would be far greater still than anybody imagined they would be in 2022 or 2023 than anybody imagined they were likely to be several years ago.
Well, that, of course, is a statement about a number of things. But do you have in mind any other tax increase? I would not recommend a tax increase at the current moment, if by that you meant an increase in the general level of income taxes. But
I would not raise rates in an across-the-board way. I think that there are a variety of abuses that are worth going after. I think we may have talked on this call about the fact that the audit rate on high-income people has come down by more than 50% over the last decade. Without going into all the details, I think a thorough study, which I've done along with Natasha Sarin, who's now working at the Treasury Department, would suggest that we could raise hundreds of billions of dollars, possibly even $1 trillion over 10 years through stepping up our efforts at tax enforcement. And it's hard for me to believe that would take a little money out of the private sector, and so it would reduce aggregate demand, but I think it would increase the legitimacy of our system very substantially.
I certainly agree that any number of tax reforms are interesting subjects. Whether they're that related to cooling inflation in the here and now, I'm less sure. But you raised the issues for the fisc, and I wonder, how worried should we be? You raised the specter of declining tax revenues. At the same time, we're likely to see an increase in defense spending in this country and in most industrial countries. Interest rates are rising, and the debt is largely short. How worried should we be about deficits, fiscal outlook generally, given whether it's revenue, defense, rates in the budget? Is this a problem?
I am more worried about it than I was a couple of years ago. because I think we had some pulling forward of revenue, because my assessment of what's going to be necessary to spend on national security, I would use the term national security because I would want to include increased diplomacy. I'd want to include increased efforts where we're spending nothing in what I think is almost criminal neglect on avoiding global pandemic with respect to climate change. So I would call it national security. I think the needs there have increased quite substantially. I think that probably, when the data comes in, it looks like productivity in the first half of this year will have declined by a few percent. And I'm not sure exactly why that's happening, but I think that one would probably be revising downwards the long-term rate of economic growth. So I think there are real grounds for concern about our fiscal situation over the medium term. I think you can't focus on everything at once. And my own view would be that the biggest concern we have is getting inflation under control, that a secondary concern is a variety of things we can do that I talked about in the tax area to make globalization work. And a third concern would be in some areas, I think, like the IRS example that I mentioned, where I think we are just very short on necessary public spending.
I would certainly agree with that. I also agree this isn't a this-minute action, but it strikes me in the medium run, fiscal consolidation is going to be necessary. We might well disagree on how. I would do that on the vast bulk of it on the spending side, with entitlement reform for the affluent. You might do it with tax increases, but that is a subject our leaders are going to have and face, not today, but sometime over the next several years. I think you would agree with that.
I suspect so. I think I'm less certain than you are, Glenn, because I do think that it is possible that the secular stagnation concerns that were defining of the 2012 to 2019 period, when we seem to have a chronic excess of savings over investment and an absorption problem, I think there's a plausible chance that that kind of thing will recur in a few years. And if it does, it will have implications for the level of interest rates. It will have implications for the challenge of maintaining demand that will require a less traditional approach to fiscal policy. So I am less certain of what you asserted than I would have been at some other points.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because you and I talked about some long-term issues ranging from secular stagnation to populism. But before we get there, I wanted to go around the world a little bit and talk about the U.S. and China together. Obviously, both economies face core opportunities and challenges. From my own perspective, China faces very difficult challenges in maintaining growth for a number of reasons and internal demand. The U.S. faces a very significant challenge in bolstering productivity growth and returning to what I think we might both agree is an important role in the global stage for better international institutions. Do you accept those challenges? And what do you think about the possibility of so-called decoupling between the United States and China, which I at least would see as quite costly were it to occur, although some of it is going to occur gradually as a result of normal business practice?
I'd rather be playing our hand than playing their hand.
Completely agree.
I'd much rather live in a country that huge amounts of capital are trying to get into than live in a country that huge amounts of capital are trying to get out of. I think between the demography, the COVID, the question of engines of demand, I have many concerns for China. And I think there's a substantial chance that a generation from now, people will look back at what was said about China in 2020 with the same kind of bemusement that they look back at what was said about Japan in 1990 or what was said about Russia in 1960. And I think it is enormously important that we not position ourselves in a way that makes it easy for us to be scapegoated for the difficulties that China is likely to encounter. And I think gratuitous truculence in that context can be quite problematic. And I think there is a bit of a bipartisan tendency in that direction in our country. I think that we have a lot to lose from decoupling. And part of what we have to lose from decoupling is the leverage that comes from connection. Because if we are decoupled, then we have much less leverage than we do if we are engaged in a variety of ongoing relationships. So I don't think we have to feel good about the prospects for China's political evolution for it to be advantageous for us to engage in mutual exchange with China. Clearly, we need to protect a variety of our security interests. But gosh, Glenn, I think we take real risks if we define our policy as seeking to separate. That's a strategy in which we have even less opportunity to put forward our ideas, less opportunity for our example to be observed, less opportunity for there to be forced continued contact out of mutual economic interest. I think it would be I think it could be a very, very serious mistake.
I agree, and a very risky one for us. I know our time's getting short, so I wanted to turn to the very long run with two issues. One where I expect we may disagree, and the other where we likely would agree. I'm not sure I would accept that secular stagnation is the problem I'd be most worried about over the long term. Rather, I'm much more worried about productivity growth for the U.S. and what that plays. I know certainly your views quite well on that. One where I expect that we would agree is that populism's role, not just in this country, but in a number of industrial democracies, is not a positive for long-term growth or frankly, for democratic institutions. If I could be so bold, I would welcome your thoughts.
I think that's right. And I think the question is what to do about it. And I think that all of us who've been very fortunate, and all of us who are privileged to belong to institutions like the Economic Club of New York need to work harder than certainly I did for many years to understand what's going on across our whole country and to understand some of the reasons for the seething resentment that propelled Donald Trump into the presidency. I think there are many things that we take for granted that if you step back from them are, it's understandable why they would generate resentment. To take just one example that occurred to me recently, I'll bet there are at least a couple of dozen people on this call whose children get extra time on tests because the children went to psychologists who evaluated them at a 4-digit cost and concluded that it was necessary and appropriate that they get that time. Well, I think it's a safe assumption that for the vast majority of Americans, that idea would not be one that would come into play at all. And I think that's obviously not a hugely important issue, but it is emblematic of many things where people see elites as more self-serving and less well-intentioned than elites see themselves as being. Yeah, I think for all of us, that requires some soul searching.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, Larry, and I agree with you. You know, my wife has always divided the world into two groups of people, economists and real people. And it would behoove us to spend a little bit more time focusing on this as the question of, what to do about it. There have been periods in American history, the progressive movement, parts of the 19th century reforms where populism was addressed and met with positive changes, but we don't appear yet to be in that period. We might have a minute for just a fast lightning round. Oh, there's Barbara. Maybe we.
No, fast lightning round's good.
Well, the lightning round I had in mind, Larry, dollar is the reserve currency for the foreseeable future. I say yes.
Yes.
Inflation back to 4% within a year? No.
50-50, but not to 3.
BBB 2.0 will happen? No. Build back better.
50-50.
Tax increase coming in the next year? No.
It won't happen without BBB. That's the same question as BBB.
Okay. All right, Barbara, that's our lightning round. We'll give it back to you.
Wow, that was a terrific conversation. Thank you both so much. Lots to think about as we look forward into the future. I'm pleased to report we have additional great speakers on the calendar. As always, we encourage you to invite guests to our events. Next up, we have Sarah Armbruster, the president and CEO of Steelcase. She's going to talk about how to actually earn your employees' commute. So that'll be an interesting conversation. Then we have the CEO and president of Fannie Mae, David Benson. And by the way, he's going to focus on the issue that came up today about affordable housing and what can and should be done and is being done on that score. We're expecting David Malpass, the head of the World Bank, for a hybrid event on September 19th. And that'll be followed October the 11th by Loretta Mester, the president and CEO of the Fed in Cleveland, October 11th. We then will have Ruth Brown, the president and CEO of the Ronald McDonald House, talking about all things New York. And then October 13th, we're lucky enough to be hosting Joe Manchin, Senator Manchin. And I just want to mention we are going to be rescheduling club trustee Arvind Krishna, the chair and CEO of IBM, for the fall. We do have a soft date, but I'm not going to give it till it's a firm date. And we're working on many more. So stay tuned. And then finally, I want to recognize those of our 347 members of the Centennial Society that joined us today as their contributions continue to help provide the financial backbone of support for the club. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Glenn. Great conversation once again. And we look forward to seeing everyone soon. Thank you.